So Christina Vassilialo joined Philadelphia and the Fabric Workshop and Museum 2 weeks ago. We're thrilled to welcome her to this community that is a community known for its collaboration, its cooperative spirit, and its ambition. We look forward to being a part of those spirits with you moving forward. We had a great collaboration with the Fabric Workshop last season when we co-presented major Bill Viola works. We look forward to thinking up new things with you and your tenure here. So please join me in welcoming Christina.
Hi, everyone. Since I'm so new here, almost everyone is like a potential new friend, so that's really exciting. If you don't recognize me, it's okay. As you just heard from Brooke, I'm like 2 weeks in. So thank you so much to our host, PAFA, for making space in their calendar for our Making Space panel discussion tonight, which is intended to offer new perspectives on Room for Living, Jacolby Satterwhite's solo exhibition at the Fabric Workshop and Museum, open through Sunday. So if you haven't seen it yet, please come by and take a look. I would also like to thank our supporters, without whom none of this would be possible. The Joy of Giving Something, Inc., Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, National Endowment for the Arts, Maya Poundgarten, our board president, and her husband, John Parker, Budman Industries, the Sachs Program for Arts Innovation, University of Pennsylvania, as well as the Marion Bolton Kippy Stroud Foundation for its leadership support. Before turning it over to our illustrious panel, I want to recount the moment that I met Jacolby. It was just a few days after we had announced my appointment to the Fabric Workshop. We both happened to be at an event in Cleveland, which is where I came from, and I thought, okay, I should go introduce myself. His show is up at the space I'm about to run. And so he very enthusiastically took great pains to explain to me how working with our studio staff has changed the course of his practice and the way that he makes his work. To me, that was just one good indicator, one more indicator that I'd made the right decision to totally upend my life and come here to Philadelphia. And so, you know, what was so exciting about all of that and hearing just straight from an artist we had worked with was that we had helped him dream big. And we also put our audience members, such as yourself, in touch with those big dreams. And so now I'm going to hand it over to yet another person on our staff who helps our artists dream big, our curator, Karen Patterson. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, and welcome to Philadelphia and the Fabric Workshop and Museum. We're so delighted to have you. I'm also really happy to be here to talk about the idea of making space. It's in honor of Jacolby Satterwhite and the residency here at the Fabric Workshop, but it's also really important for us to think about what it means to make space. We chose this topic for several reasons. It's at the core of what we do here at the Fabric Workshop. That is, it's an invitation to collaborate. It's an offer for artists to open up their practice, to chart new territory, to look under the bed, to peek behind the doors, and to head somewhere just out of range. This proposition to make room is to pry open what is often a typically solitary studio experience in order for new ideas to flourish comes with a reassurance that the artists in residence will be shored up by a team of artists on our staff who thrive in the unknown, in the unexplored areas of creative work. The idea of making room, of creating space, is often used with discussing Jacolby Satterwhite's work. His approach is akin to world building, as he manipulates and sutures architecture, terrain, bodies, images, family history, both in ephemeral and real realms, all to usher in exhilarating new forms of agency and autonomy. An exchange between Sean Capone and Satterwhite in a recent Bomb magazine article really articulates and captures the crux of the panel tonight. In this article, Capone writes, "The consistent thing in your work is how you make an exterior world to inhabit out of an inner space of imagination and desire. To me, that's part of the whole project of being queer in this world." In reply, Satterwhite said, "Right. To survive as a queer person in this world, you extrude a fantasy and commit to it, assimilating into structures where you don't necessarily belong. I create safe spaces to stay sane. I used to think that I was just world building as escapism, creating a space for my own personal language to thrive. But as I get older, I feel less private and divisive, more generous, like a form of poetry." And so with that prompt, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel. Each person will present for about 5 minutes on their insights on Satterwhite's work, and then Jacolby himself will talk to us a little bit about his ideas that have blossomed in this residency. And then we'll open it up to some questions. So our first panelist will be Stuart Comer. He was appointed Chief Curator at the Department of Media and Performance at the Museum of Modern Art in 2013. He oversees the department program of exhibitions, events, acquisitions, and collections. Mr. Comer was the co-curator, of the 2014 Whitney Biennial, where he invited Jacolby to present new work, and previously served as the first curator of film at Tate Modern London, where he oversaw film and video work for the Tate collection and displays, and was the co-curator for the opening program of the Tanks at the Tate Modern. Jack McGrath is an art historian based in New York. He has taught art history and critical theory at Barnard College, Columbia University School of the Arts, Cooper Union, Parsons Schools of Design, and Yeshiva College. His writing has appeared in Frieze, October Files, among others. And in 2017, he curated an exhibition called Visual Notes for an Upside-Down World at PPOW Gallery in New York that included Satterwhite's work. And then, of course, Jacolby Satterwhite. His interdisciplinary practice includes video, performance, 3D animation, fiber and printmaking, drawing from an extensive set of references, queer theory, modernism, video game history, personal mythology. He synthesizes multiple disciplines in immersive installations. He holds a BFA from MICA and an MFA from UPenn. He is represented by Mitchell Innocent Nash in New York, Moran in LA, and London Gallery in Mallorca, Spain. Satterwhite's work is in the collections of MoMA, the Whitney Museum of Art, Studio Museum in Harlem, where I first saw his work, among others. He is, of course, and we're so proud that he is the artist in residence here at the Fabric Workshop, from 2018 and 2019, in which he collaborated with our studio to create a whole new body of work that focused on sculpture and figure. I hope that plays.
No.
Had to. And with that, I'd like to invite Stuart Comer to the panel.
Okay, Jacolby Satterwhite in 5 minutes. This is going to be interesting. Thank you so much to the Fabric Workshop and also to PAFA for the invitation to be here. It's very nice to be in Philadelphia. I'm thrilled to be able to see Jacolby's show here. Welcome. It's exciting that you're going to start your tenure while the show is on view. It's great. So space and rooms for living, room for doubt in this case, as you see in this amazing new sculpture. When I was working with Jacolby for the 2014 Biennial at the Whitney, I think he was spending about 4 days on end with no sleep, working on Maya software and other forms of animating softwares. And it's really interesting to watch this shift into physical objects now, because to some extent, I think Jacolby's work has really exploded on many levels conventional ideas of space, and yet at the same time, it's tied to very art historical ideas about space. And I had to kind of dust my art history brain off a little bit for this talk, because one of the most obvious references in the case of Room for Doubt, of course, is the Caravaggio painting, The Doubting of St. Thomas. And I wanted to show this as well because I think this sort of probing of a wound opened up some interesting ideas in terms of how this might relate relate to Jacolby's work. And the sort of the space of the wound or the space of the cut is something one might think about within these worlds that he constructs in his videos, and now in the kind of tableaus and platforms that are the core of the show here at the Fabric Workshop. I guess in thinking about Paul's text and this idea of trans bodies, both as being kind of modulated by testosterone and pharmaceuticals, but also by cuts in many ways, I think is a really compelling idea for me. And I kept thinking about the way Jacolby's work sort of cuts in space, and increasingly too, with these objects being made with 3D printers, how the very act of sculpture itself has shifted with these new technologies. I also started to think about, some of the forebears for Caravaggio, like Donatello in particular. And I chose this particular object because it's only recently been attributed to Donatello, about 4 or 5 years ago, after a lot of speculation. And it's this idea of speculation, of speculative histories, of speculative environments that I think is so key to what Jacolby is doing. But also Donatello, of course, was the sculptor that really introduced movement into Western sculpture. And this idea of the body in motion is another major feature in Jacolby's work. And Donatello was not only looking at it in terms of the motion of the viewer around a sculpture, but in these friezes, it was almost a proto-cinematic way of thinking about the relation of bodies and time and movement, many centuries before the advent of cinema as we know it today. But these are all ideas that I think, again, really circulate in interesting ways in this play between the virtual and the real, that is getting even more complicated in Jacolby's work now that he is outputting some of this archive of images into physical objects through things like 3D printing. To go back to Caravaggio for a moment, I was also thinking about Derek Jarman's film on Caravaggio, which was specifically about the relationship between painting and cinema. And many people have looked at Caravaggio's work as, using this kind of chiaroscuro technique of really introducing theatrical space or a kind of cinematic space into painting, again, centuries before cinema as we know it had been invented. It's a film that I actually think about a lot. But also, in terms of Jacolby's work, I think Derek, of course, was really primarily interested in queer bodies. And so, again, going back to Paul Preciado as well, to think about the bodies in Jacolby's work, not as sort of neutral bodies whatsoever, but those that carry forth different kinds of queer histories and queer notions is something to really think about. I think as Jarman was investigating Caravaggio's own history, these were things he was actively thinking about in the context of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s in Thatcher's Britain. Much like Reagan's America, the politics around the epidemic were fraught and very complicated. And I wanted to come back to this idea of sort of illness in Jacolby's work in a few minutes. Voguing as well, speaking of queer bodies, is another major feature in Jacolby's earlier performances as well, many of which he would then green screen into the videos. It's really interesting now that these new sculptures are kind of freezing this, almost going in the opposite direction of how we normally think of these things evolving, but taking the sort of circular and very camp motions of voguing and kind of freezing them into place. This is an earlier image of Jacolby around the time we were working together at the Whitney, when he was creating these incredibly outrageous costumes as well for his performances, often with monitors within them. And so I think this is an important early instance of embedding smaller monitors. And as much as the work is about immersion in these very elaborate, almost Baroque environmental spaces, he's often played with shifts in scale, as you see here, and I think you see it in the new sculptural work as well, this play between the sort of sculptural tableaus and these sort of ceiling-mounted monitors and other ways of bringing the moving image into play with the bodies in the work. But I also wanted to talk about animation for a minute, and the degree to which, in many ways, I think Jacolby's use of voguing is as much about drawing as it is histories of ballroom culture or conventional ideas of dance or movement. He's also been very influenced by various choreographers, and Bill Forsyth in particular. But Bill as well was very interested in this idea of the relationship between the line and the gesture, the line and movement. And Anthony Mccall, whose work you might know, a really important structuralist filmmaker who began making these films in the 1970s that he called solid light films. And so effectively the film, over the roughly 20 minutes of its duration, begins with just a point of light on the screen that gradually draws itself into a circle. This was made on an early rotoscoping animation bed, which is many generations removed from the kinds of animation technologies that Jacolby is using. But I wanted to make the point that animation is no longer about just a single point or a single line or a flat two-dimensional surface. But I think what Anthony really did was to translate that into an immersive 3 or even 4-dimensional environment. And what you see when a viewer encounters this is no longer what you're doing right now, sitting in a cinema or in a proscenium space, passively watching this pass before your eyes, but rather there was a lot of visitor engagement in the work. It became a participatory environment in which the image, the space of projection, and the apparatus of projection all become one thing, in effect. And I think somehow this idea of a lot of animated bodies in an environment of this nature, for me, has a lot of interesting parallels to what Jacolby is doing. And frequently, he would invite any number of people into the studio and would record them, again, using green screen technologies to then sort of zap them into his work. But I think there is this idea of a sort of communal space, of a collective space in his work. And I think this is exactly what Mccall was also trying to do, to turn cinema from a passive experience into a very active one of community formation within the space of cinema. But of course, the relationship, again, between the space and that kind of social space that he constructed and the two-dimensional drawing is really interesting. And he makes very beautiful drawings. This is a page from a recent publication about them. But this also brings us to Jacolby's mother, Patricia Satterwhite, who sadly passed away a few years ago, but did these incredible drawings. She was obsessed with the Home Shopping Network and would draw possible prototypes for things that she might sell, different kinds of hypothetical or, again, speculative commodities. And I think this has been a huge part of the way Jacolby has translated his relationship to his mother into his work by, again, literally almost like rotoscoping these drawings into three-dimensional animated forms, as the one you see here, creating these juxtapositions between those objects and the bodies, and again, returning to this idea of the archive. So his archive includes his own very personal relationship with his mother, but also the work that she was producing. He translates that, literally into architecture for the participants in his films to act out these encounters. I also just want to mention quickly, for those of you who are interested in Caravaggio, I think one of the key theorists of Caravaggio in recent years was Leo Bersani. Bersani wrote a brilliant book on Caravaggio. But then many years later, he also wrote an important book called Intimacies. And in Intimacies, as he starts to really challenge conventional ideas of psychoanalysis, he, like Derek Jarman, had been heavily impacted by the AIDS crisis. And then he began to examine what he found to be a very fascinating phenomenon amongst younger gay men who had not originally been part of the AIDS epidemic, but as what is called barebacking, effectively unsafe sex, began to become much more prominent in the queer community. And this was before the current medications like PrEP, which would effectively protect you from getting HIV. But the culture of barebacking became a really key focus for the book Intimacies. As you see in the video Reifying Desire 6, actually, not 3, Jacolby also started to involve various actors like the one he's posed with here, who were very much part of a pornographic scene in which there was a lot of barebacking. And I bring this up again because if you think back to the painting of St. Thomas in Caravaggio, this idea of a rupture, of sort of a penetration of the male body. These are things that are inherent to queer culture that are still often taboo in a general cultural conversation. But I think it's something very important to address in Jacolby's work, and to begin to think, if you want to talk about rooms and constructing space, what these kinds of spaces really mean. But again, how that then gets translated again into back into 2 dimensions or even 3 dimensions is something I'm really interested in, and how Patricia Satterwhite's drawings continue to become these kind of vehicles. The cock on wheels that you see at the beginning of the show on the second floor is really compelling. So it's not just about the construction of space, but how you move through it, and in what you move through it. What are the structures that allow this mobility in the work? But again, it's this constant juxtaposition, too, between drawing, film, and environment, a physical sculpture, and the way these are sort of collapsed or in dialogue with each other, that I think has everything to do with the moment that we're in. And I had an interesting conversation with a young colleague the other day about how the emerging generation of artists is less interested in cyberspace or in the space of the internet. They are looking for moments of physical connection, of IRL, in real life, real-time engagement, public assembly like the one we're in right now, and somehow trying to move away from digital alienation. So to some extent, I think those operations are happening in Jacolby's work. I think he is trying to find a way of forming safe spaces, if you want to call it that, although I think they're also spaces of risk, but definitely spaces of engagement, encounter, and community. Finally, I just wanted to leave you with one more Caravaggio and a few earlier works of Jacolby, where again, I think he starts to think through this idea of himself kind of inhabiting these different kind of historical corpses, as it were, and like the Christ and the deposition, but constantly translating those. Nothing is stable in his work. It's always challenging the idea of a linear history, and he kind of embodies the shells of history in this way and continues to reanimate them so that they find new possibilities and new urgencies. And I will leave it there, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart. And now I'd like to invite Jack McGrath to share his insights.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. I'm grateful to the Fabric Museum workshop and to Jacolby. I'm very excited about talking about this work. I just advance it with the arrows? Yeah, great. So spaces, surface, skin. Jacolby Satterwhite and the Materiality of Cultural Reproduction. I'm working on a slightly larger project in and around some of this work. I'm interested in all these works and the other works, both Jacolby's and those by other artists and cultural practitioners, to which they're linked. And some of the themes that I'd like to address in 5 minutes, if I can, are cultural reproduction and biological reproduction, and sort of the metaphors of overlap there. Non-sexual reproduction and non-reproductive sexuality. And what I was really struck by with this particular cycle of works from Jacolby was that it's no longer possible to sort of ignore the real violence that's just barely submerged in the work, but that's articulated in a way that doesn't wound our shame before historical victims, which is it's a paraphrase of Adorno talking about the ethics of the representation of violence, and do you represent it directly when, there's a good possibility it could be just exciting or some sort of limiting circumstance to prove the enduring human condition. There's other ways of making reference to that violence, and I think it's pretty powerful here. So I want to talk about some of the art history in the work, so we'll just walk through some of them, and I'll just give you some notes about how to, the way I've been thinking about them. It won't necessarily be conclusive. So this is Room for Cleansing. It's one of the first works that you see. It's the second work. The clear citation here is of the Demoiselle d'Avignon, and it's Picasso's work of 1907. Some say the first Cubist painting, although that's a subject of some debate in Cubism circles. And we can see that Jacolby has not just reiterated the work, there's a lot of alteration here. The Demoiselle was recently the subject of some controversy. Controversy seems to follow this painting since Picasso debuted it, and even his good friend said it looked like he'd been drinking gasoline before he painted it. But Faith Ringgold studied Demoiselle and the Guernica, which were both at MoMA during the 60s, two of his most famous paintings, both of which are violent in their way. There are citations of the Demoiselle in the Ringgold, but this was a recent controversy at the newly installed MoMA Painting and Sculpture Galleries. So Jacolby's work is...
Painting and Sculpture Galleries.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, what are they now? What is it now?
Collection Galleries.
Yes. No art history at the MoMA. Okay. I think it'll stabilize. So we have a citation of the demoiselle there. Obviously, Stuart has done me the great favor of queuing this up. This is the Room for Doubt. And you can see that the composition of the figures in a kind of Romanesque arch, although we have it sort of bent on a bias here, almost in a spiral form, maybe a Fibonacci sequence, is a citation of the Caravaggio. And the Caravaggio is well known for a lot of homoeroticism in his works. This is some of the most striking and indeed violent homoeroticism in his works that are specifically about Christ, life of Christ, or the afterlife of Christ, as it may be. In that we have the doubting Thomas penetrating his body, this invagination of the body of Christ. And you'll note also that there's no penetration here. So we might wonder about that. Is this more alienated? Is it less violent? I would probably say no, but also think about the similarities in the figure on the figures on the left. It's essentially the same figure iterated 4 times, whereas on the right you have the clear distinction between the sort of doddering old apostles and the beautiful, youthful, even in death, Christ. This is a painting that, or at least an arrangement that Jacolby has cited earlier in more than one of the Reifying Desire pieces. This is still from the opening sequence of Reifying Desire 3, the Immaculate Conception of Doubting Thomas. And already there you see that Doubting Thomas is brought into a relationship with Mary and St. Anne, would say, the Immaculate Conception of Mary. But the idea of a non-sexual reproduction is already there in the context of homoerotic penetration. And indeed, these lips of the wound, it begins like this, sort of a lovely, rather bleak beginning of these isolated figures in this nowhere. They are sort of undefined in relation to one another, except, of course, for the Christ, in keeping with the Caravaggio, sort of dual-gendered, or perhaps ambiguously gendered, perhaps multiply gendered, and with long blonde hair, and I'll refer to that long braid again. These lips of the wound, as I said, will double as other kinds of mouths and orifices and other works in the Reifying Desire series. Just in this particular work, when you enter the wound, the camera, as if you were journeying within Christ's wound, goes past those lips and through this archway, this sort of archetypal gateway, as it were, and an enormous world opens up within it. There's a lot of black boxing, a lot of mise en abîme in Jacolby's work, where one world ends up being a macrocosm for the microcosmoi within it. I also want to draw your attention to this part of the work, which I was fairly stunned by when Jacolby sent it to me. It's the surface that they stand on. And, I recognized immediately what it was, and just how clever it is in condensing so many different networks of association. So, I'm almost tempted to ask you what you think it looks like, but I have 5 minutes. So it looks like let's see, it's got bilateral symmetry. It's got sort of a type of radial symmetry. It looks a little like an Oriental rug, as we say, a Persian rug. Other kind of terms for rugs that signify exoticism, signify global trade and colonialism, the things that become part of our domestic interiors that were taken from elsewhere and are there to remind us that there is an elsewhere far away that we can take things from because we happen to reside where we do. It looks like a Rorschach, right? Ink block tests. You look at this sort of amorphous object and, what does it mean to you? It's not coincidentally of Jacolby's skin. So I immediately, someone has been flayed to make this. Something has been flayed. Quite a lot of violence here. This body with this type of skin in the context of a beautiful, expensive, exotic design object taken from elsewhere and brought to these shores in an act of violence. It's also a skin, the other kind of skin, that is to say part of the digital design process, wherein the rig, right? Is that what it's called? Rig or the skeleton?
UV map.
UV map, yes.
Yeah.
Is the exterior or the skin or the?
So you like upload that image onto the figure and
It wraps around. So the skin is the sort of term of art for the exterior surface of digitally rendered objects in certain kinds of animation and rendering software. This happens to be skin that is depicting skin, but it could just as well be the surface of this podium or of a building or of a tree. So we have skin that is a skin, and this is indeed the arrangement of the skin, of Jacolby's skin, to cover the image of Jacolby's body in digital renderings or digital animation, such that the software can recognize it and manipulate it and wrap it appropriately. The surface of each limb and member around the apparatus beneath it that supports it. So you have it's arranged sort of decoratively, but also rationally, at least according to the needs of a computer. 3 minutes, great, okay. This is another work in the series, A Room for a Levitating Bed. As Stuart told us, this is a citation also of Reifying Desire, Islands of Treasure. It's somewhat of a coincidence that Antonio Biaggi happens to look a little bit like Jacolby, particularly in the way that they are deployed in the larger video, where they are easily mistaken for one another, and then they collapse in this piece into two. The piece is coated, again, a skin, a surface, right, with a kind of glass bead, aluminum glass bead that you might see on street signs or maybe on sneakers, that catches the light such that it might look like this when you're looking at it with your eyes, with your physical body. But if you take a photograph with a flash, it becomes this. So, we may have moved in Jacolby's work definitively into a three-dimensional space, but here always the order of the digital disrupts our ability to see things directly, right? When we interpose the phone with its flash camera in between ourselves and the image, it completely alters the way it looks. I would offer, not coincidentally, whites it out, deprives it of all depth, and blinds us to everything else that's around it. Here we have Room for Ascension. I like Room for Ascension, right? So it's a room in which one could ascend, maybe, or maybe we've got some room that we could ascend a little more. And there's a lot of dialectical play in Jacolby's work, play of opposites. And you can see it's got two moods here. These are two different images of the same work in different lighting. That is part of the work itself as the lighting changes. These figures here, I immediately thought of orant figures, that is to say praying figures. They were very common in early Christian iconography. It's a sort of standard gesture of appeal to the Lord, to something divine and something celestial, something up there. There is the one figure that is separate, though, who reminds me of nothing more than Giotto's Lamentation. This is St. John's gesture of dismay. Throne here. I'm going to move through this a little bit quicker. This is still from the Matrix Rhapsody from 2012. On the right, an image of Patricia Satterwhite. This is Jacolby's mother. Throne, these are the digital renderings of the drawing at the left made by Patricia herself. The throne that she's sitting in here is sometimes called a peacock chair, sometimes called a manila chair, another artifact of a legacy of colonialism and then international capitalist trade. Sometimes sometimes called a Philippine chair, sometimes called a throne chair, sometimes called a king chair, and it took on a particularly strong context in the middle of the 20th century. Jacolby also uses it here in this piece of Birds in Paradise, right? Thank you. Where it's a Colosseum space, and all of the audience are Jacolbys, each of whom has his own king chair. So all the citizenry of this Rome sit in identical spaces. They seem a little unruly at first, but by the end they snap in line, almost literally, becoming what Siegfried Kraka called the mass ornament. You'll see the mass ornament in Stalinist parades, fascist rallies, the Rockettes, or the Beijing Olympics, the opening and closing of the Beijing Olympics. Yeah, I'm almost up. Okay, so this is Jacolby's citation of it is partially in citation of his mother, but also a memory of this image, this famous image where the peacock chair took on its sort of most salient cultural connotations. That it's a Huey P. Newton's photograph of Huey P. Newton by the Black Panther Party, wherein he's sitting in the peacock chair in the manner of, I don't know why my titles are not showing up here, but that's Ingres, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, the Napoleon on his imperial throne, 1806, I believe. And this is the sculpture of Olympian Zeus, one of the 7 wonders of the world, lost long ago. Patricia's a little more relaxed. She doesn't have a gun or a spear. She's got a cigarette. She's not in single point perspective, that hieratic frontality. She's relaxed in a three-quarter view, an invitation, sort of tenderly leaning against the chair, as if it already had become a fond memory of a potential maybe lost for the moment. Patricia's Jacolby's mother, so she's a sort of biological source of this person. She's also generationally, when we talk about generations, we think of parental generations, familial generations, that sort of Oedipal relationship. She's also a generation of artists from whom Jacolby has drawn so much of his practice. So it's convenient. There's been a lot of sort of hand-wringing in art history over the past couple of decades about what role biography plays in work. I mean, I think we can all say it plays quite a large role, and that's wonderful. But conveniently here, the artistic and biological generations are collapsed. They're one and the same. And it's important with Jacolby's work, especially as it moves into these three-dimensional physical objects, to remember that every kind of cultural transmission has a material substrate, right? The internet, the digital world, when I was much younger, people used to talk about it as if it were evanescing into the ether, and of course not. There are, we still have cords. You need servers. You need banks of servers that, require enormous amounts of energy to keep them cool even. There is base materiality here. The materiality of the body is something we don't often like to think about, and the Caravaggio is, of course, about that. It's made during the Counter-Reformation, when a return to the embodiment, the splendor, the luxury, the material, the spectacle of the church and indeed of the body, both of Christ and of saints, was a big deal. And we see that in the insertion with the wound. As I was researching this project, I thought about, wow, a rug made from human skin. To use the body in such a way, it seems like such a violation. And it turns out that Philadelphia has quite an amazing history of it. It's really, really shocking. I mean, parts of it are sort of amusing, and parts of it are really, really disturbing. This is a collection of anthropodermic bibliopagy, which are a surprisingly common tradition of making books, or at least binding books, out of human skin. Eminently modern phenomenon, began after the Renaissance and cleared up, we hope, toward the end of the 19th, early 20th century. This is 1884. This is a woman who died right near here, a young Irish immigrant woman. She died of consumption and trichinosis. And the 23-year-old male doctor who treated her, who I guess they became friendly, although what he did next was not so friendly. Do we know the story as a famous in Philadelphia? He says it here proudly in the book that he bound with her skin after keeping her for 20 years. He cut skin from her body and then he tanned in a pot de chambre, in a chamber pot. So he probably used urine. It's hard to know what he was thinking. It seems like a horrific desecration, but and indeed a lot of times bodies of criminals. It was always people at the margins, so immigrants, the poor, women often, and it's the books that he bound with her skin are about pregnancy and childbirth, and they're right down the street at a museum named for Mother. It's the Mutter Museum. I know. I'm sorry. I'm almost done. It's like 2 more slides. Okay. So this is also in Philadelphia. Scientific American, the largest object made of human skin. This saddle of tanned human skin. The quotation isn't there. All right. I'll read it from here really quickly. So this one was really dark. Leather from human skin. This is from 1888, Philadelphia News. I remember that this opens. I remember that 2 or 3 years ago, I incidentally referred to a prominent physician of this city, Philadelphia, wearing shoes made from the skin of Negroes. He still adhered to that custom, insisting that the tanned hide of an African makes the most enduring and most pliable leather known to man. Yeah. And then, of course, there's this, which I won't show you for too long, but this is from Buchenwald, wherein inmates were chosen based on the attractiveness of their tattoos to be murdered and then their skin used as design objects. So I thought it was particularly, historically just appropriate and really kind of moving that this skin of Jacolby's is covered in tattoos, of course, made from his mother's drawings, right? And the placement is this right by the navel, right? So think about it, his mother's drawings. How lovely it is being as I am, right by the belly button. And right above that other portal to penetration is the archway, that archway that brought us into Christ's body at the beginning. Yeah, there it is.
Wow.
And there's Patricia on her wedding day. So. This is from Matriarch's Rhapsody.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Well, I don't know if any of you watched The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, but that's the kind of freestyle you're about to get. Cause oh my God, Stuart and Jack, Jesus Christ. My birthday's 5 days away, but you don't even have to show up to the party. That was enough. Thank you so much for that. I'm not gonna get the Matriarch's Rhapsody. Well, it doesn't matter, but I mean, maybe. Oh, that's
It should be next. Am I going the wrong way? Yes.
It's okay. You can just put it on the archway, I guess. Oh, there we go. Yeah. All right, so this is such a bittersweet evening, and it's kind of anticlimactic because I've been so low-key about everything, so I'm just kind of like here and just taking it in. But since I'm doing my Marvelous Mrs. Maisel act, here we go. So I think eventually I'll stop playing the Matriarch's Rhapsody at my artist talks, but since we built a lot of sculptures around those objects, and since I'm kind of entering a new decade and a new thought and a new pattern, a new rhythm and a system, I kind of want to have this play while I kind of look back at what just happened. So first and foremost, I want to thank the studio staff and the faculty and the curators and the newcomers. I couldn't I feel like since we're talking about Renaissance paintings, I feel like the fabric workshop are my little cherubs that just like lifted me up and and really like helped me kind of break through a lot of my like fears and personal anxieties around my own studio process. I kind of work alone. I've had an isolating practice for a decade. It's cheaper that way, and I can drink more alcohol. Truly, my addictions make me work alone. So it's been kind of an interesting thing. I taught, ever since I was, and that's probably because I come from a painting background. In a painting background, if you're working like, I was really into German expressionism and like a lot of like visceral kind of like methods and strategies to making paintings. So when I shifted into performance and digital media, my sensibility just only understood isolated processes, which is why I kind of repeated my body in the work over and over for half of the body of work. And it's really like, it's funny because I'm so committed to my process that it sort of, I didn't know that my process sort of kind of like weaved into my own lifestyle, my own sensibility as a human being, alienating me from my social space. Even though I'm a very social and fun person sometimes, working kind of like, I became like a man-child in a way because all I did was work on these animations, for 12 hours a day, doing 12 residencies for 10 years, sometimes sleeping in -1 degree studios on the floor just so I can make it for Stuart Comer's Whitney Biennial. And what I am trying to say is it made my practice super isolating and private and and because it was a big project and it was a chronological project that was 6 parts, that was pretty much a feature-length animation for the first series, I kind of end up mimicking my mother's strategy for working, because she kind of worked like she was Emily Dickinson upstairs, isolated, like kind of working in that one. And so when I shifted into the new series, Birds in Paradise, and I got invited by the Fabric Workshop and Pioneer Works at the same time to produce these shows, and I was also coming off of that exhibition I did at Gavin Brown, and I was also living in New York for the first time. I began to, my work is so much about art history because my life was so much about being in a cave in Provincetown and during the off time of winter making work. So I was in a way doing talk therapy with myself, using art history's past and my own present, like my childhood, speaking to my child self, speaking to my mother, speaking to the way that I look at pop culture, politics in the past, and trying to consolidate that into a form that made sense as a queer person who felt like he didn't belong anywhere. But when I moved to New York and I developed a chosen family of queer people and interesting avant-garde creators and interesting art historians, and really kind of found like a chosen safe space for me to really think about the future, it was interesting that I happened to get this exhibition at the same time. So what was interesting about this exhibition is that like, it was having like extreme isolation for half a decade and being an extreme extrovert and trying to figure things out through like living in a new chosen queer space to learn about new ways to think about the future and think about how to make myself, how to think about work in a different way. It was like, in a way there was a friction that was really challenging. And so what was really ironic is that I came into the Fabric Workshop saying, how in the fuck can I stand still? How can I explore slowness? How can I explore things that you have, the viewer is more of the live action participant than the actual project. The viewer walks around the sculpture and creates their time-based experience, and they explore, because it was kind of like the pendulum swung the entire other way with this exhibition, and then immediately dropped me into the other exhibition at Pioneer Works that had the same sensibility, on top of me making a feature-length animation that was a giant homage to now. And so it's just funny because I'm entering the 2020s, I consolidated the public and the private, and I just feel like now I just want to be, like, my work isn't a homage to my mother. It is not an homage to anything. It's more so like I'm a millennial who had a dial-up modem since 1998. And I don't want to call it postmodern thinking. I want to call it archive thinking. Like I kind of had, what?
Post-modem thinking.
I'm postmodern thinking. I'm DHL. Oh wait, whatever. In a way, it's funny. It's kind of like, what am I trying to say? You know, the thing that I'm freestyling, so this might not go nowhere, but one thing I really, I hated the last 10 years of working this way and having a discourse with the public about my work and it being highlighted in a sentimental way about the biography, because at the end of the day, I've grown up as an artist with an objective lens that's almost borderline sociopathic in a way, because it's kind of like, in a way, it's just really important. I know what important information is when I see it, and I also know how to consolidate important information and make it clash with things that are normally seen as the opposite to build harmonious form. Because that gesture speaks to the time we're in. That's what TikTok and Instagram and Twitter and memes. What are memes? The thing that take over our country, the word that John Baldessari, rest in peace, invented. You know, like, those kind of language and disseminations of information is the way that the common person sees the world. And so me being vulnerable and making my privacy, which is my mother and her data and my friends who I kind of like cast in my work and other people I admire and muses and people I sleep with, and I don't know, whoever enters the work is who enters the work. That is just me speaking to the like contemporary zeitgeist of viewing information and media. I mean, the most valuable currency beyond oil is data and our privacy. People, data mining is worth more than anything. So as a person who would think like Bruce Nauman or Joseph Beuys or Valley Export or people in the 60s who were figuring out how to reject painting and war and how does the essential body reflect our times, what, you know, what is that? My privacy. So in a way, me giving you my privacy for 10 years wasn't because I wanted you to feel sorry for me. It was because I wanted you to understand that that is the template for now. That is what the most valuable thing that I could give you right now that reflects our time, that you all are vulnerable is your privacy. So, you know, let's chill and talk, guys. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you all. That was really fascinating. It's really exciting to hear all these perspectives of this new body of work and to have it anchor in art history, but also in kind of forward-looking understandings of your work, Jacolby. We have a little bit of time. We're at 8 o'clock, so I just want to be aware of that. I'd like to ask kind of a similar question to the panel and then maybe take one question from the audience, and then we'll wrap up for the evening. I just want to revisit the idea of making space, because you each come from a very different vantage point, one being the actual artist, and two, representing the museum, representing art history. And I want to think about how did Jacolby's work in working with it, whether you were researching it or including it in the Whitney Biennial or future exhibitions, how did you have to make space for that? Were there battles that were ensued in the boardrooms, or the idea that his work is very unstable and the museum itself and art history is kind of rigid and stable? And how did that affect your practice as a curator and an art historian?
I mean, I think it was interesting. We talked a lot about how to show Reifying Desire 6 at the Whitney and whether it should be on a smaller screen or a more immersive projection. And in the end, we landed on a screen that was sort of suspended in space. And it became more important to me because it was sort of back to the Donatello image. Like, I wanted people to walk around the screen and feel themselves moving a little bit, whereas I think in black boxes people tend to forget their bodies a little bit, if that makes sense. That's not entirely true, but in part. And at the time, you were not using sound either in the work. And now you've been working with Nick Weiss, and certainly at Pioneer Works, you took it to a whole new level. And with the SF MoMA project as well, you've produced this amazing album. The group is called Pat, named for Patricia Satterwhite, your mother. But it's incredible music as well. But again, I guess the degree to which video is still changing so radically, and that was a moment where, like, I had watched artists like Ryan Trecarton go from making work for YouTube, and I still think that was the most powerful experience of his work was seeing it on your laptop. And I was never as convinced when they started to get supersized and become large installations. So at the time, I felt a little bit the same about Jacolby's work, that I didn't necessarily want to see it get blown out of proportion, and I kind of wanted to keep it like these almost like Joseph Cornell digital jewel boxes or something. That said, now you've gone and supersized your work, and it works. It's great, and I think the work itself is so immersive, the worlds within it, and somehow that doubles down once it's at a larger scale, and I think it does work, and then the sound makes it even that much more immersive. So, but it gets back to everything I was trying to suggest with the Anthony Mccall, this relationship between an image and physical space, and how you kind of crisscross between the two. And I think you're constantly finding solutions to do that. So the physical space of a museum, there's an echo of that in this work. And I started to think too, I don't know, though some of you may have known of the artist Woody Vasuka, who passed away just a few weeks ago, really one of the major pioneers of video with his partner Stena Vasuka. But I did a talk with them when I was still in London several years ago, and they were effectively inputting their entire archive into Second Life. Now, no one even talks about Second Life anymore. But in a way, like, what that looked like was very similar to Jacolby's work. And so, you would just see these entire worlds that were just kind of folding in on each other with, like, thousands of images from their career sort of embedded. And it wasn't VR at all, but it was sort of proto-VR. And you could kind of get a sense of the sort of artificial movement through an artificial space, which is exactly the feeling you have if you sit in the chairs and watch your VR. But anyway, I just think that there are so many worlds within worlds within worlds, and images within images, and mise en abîmes in your work. And so experiencing it in an institution just amplifies that, I think.
Oftentimes when artists make a leap like that to a much larger scale, maybe a larger budget, things can go really wrong, it just doesn't translate, and it still sort of vaguely resembles the work, but it loses all of its power. That is not the case with Jacolby. He describes himself as a maximalist.
I don't know what I am.
But no, what's interesting on a lot of levels of the maximalism is that, like, when it scales up, it retains every bit of its power, and it is all the better for having lived in those digital worlds. Because what I didn't understand about maximalism until I encountered Jacolby's work is that you have to be a good maximalist, but when you're deploying signifiers, right, like especially something from everyday life, it can mean a lot of different things because it exists in a lot of different spaces. It sort of cuts across different discourses. So you, as an artist, need to sort of limit that, right? And so when you work in a maximal sphere where it's worlds within worlds, where it seems like this infinite sort of array of possibilities, it's very easy to lose any sort of specificity, any semiotic specificity for any particular signifier that's deployed, particularly when it exists in our everyday life, like a human body or a spider or a robot or a beach. But what's so interesting about Jacolby is that there's recursive practice where he sort of iterates and draws connections. And so the more you sit with the works, you keep seeing motifs repeat. And that draws them into this web of signification that sort of limits their range. That is to say, it endows them with a powerful sort of semiotic force. It means something very specific. I can point to how it does that in these 5 different other works. And yet it is 5 other works and 5 other contexts, each of which are linked to others. So there is this infinite sort of space of possibility for meaning. And meaning on an aesthetic level, cultural level, historical level, political level. it's not at all arbitrary. Much like a language, you can have many words. English works like this, and such that each individual unit in the language means something very specific and very powerful by means of its diacritical difference from all the other units in the system. So it's been really amazing to see these fragments of previous works take on this three-dimensional identity. Let me say just two things about one about biography that we were talking with Jacolby. We were actually talking about this earlier today. Jacolby and I are friends, so I know some of the circumstances that inspired some of the arrangements or some of the a motif or whatever in the work, or some memory maybe that we've discussed. There is still the danger if, say, I were to decode it, right? That it would be that stop clause that so worried the structuralists, Barth, for example, in The Death of the Author, that to give an author to a work is to give it a stop clause, right? It becomes the explanation. We stop thinking about the work. Biography or identity, filiality, maternity, these are ideas that are part of Jacolby's work almost as his materials. This is just sort of the stuff through which he builds the work, because what other stuff do we have, right? It makes reference to a vast array of other things, as as I hope I suggested. But it is nice to be able to do the biography that is so carefully and responsibly done, because it does have power. The specificity of that story, of that context, is itself the sort of the result of history, of politics, of identity. Each of us carries the realm of this. The other thing was that just the aesthetic of Jacolby's work. I mean, I did my dissertation on Piero Manzoni, who's famous for achromes, that is to say, paintings with no color. So they're not monochromes. He takes away even the last aspect of aesthetic enjoyment, and reminds us why we're all doomed. But so when I first met Jacolby, he started to show me his work, and I started to talk about it, and he slowly closed the laptop and said, maybe we'll talk about this in a couple of weeks. And indeed we did. He had to sort of ease me into it. If I had seen his work without knowing Jacolby, this is why, identity biography, the subjective individual, the sort of node of history and culture and everything else that is a human person does make a difference. I needed that guide, and my perspective on art, particularly contemporary practice, has fundamentally changed since that encounter. So it's definitely created a lot of space for me.
Wow, thank you. What's the question?
I know, I was going to go back to it. Don't worry. I was ready. I think in your case, Jacolby, because we are talking about your work and you were here, I kind of want to ask, I read somewhere that, the virtual realm was really a place for you to experiment and try a bunch of things. And then I'm wondering about what the process was working with the Fabric Workshop and extracting things from the virtual world into the real world with a bunch of other artists. And what was that space like? And what was that experience like in terms of experimentation?
Well, before the Fabric Workshop, whenever something like ever since I was exhibiting for the digital works, there's always been a sculptural relic next to it, but it was usually like, a really tedious couture costume that's sculptural, that's on a mannequin, or it was a CNC printed object that was like super Brancusi and minimalist. But what I got the chance to do here, which was really extraordinary, was make, I guess, what I call, sculpture with a capital S, because it wasn't necessarily just 3D printing. There was different kinds of surface treatments and different machines and different print. It was a hybrid of things coming together to make really concrete form to something I've been trying to articulate for years. But with all of my work, like it, one thing doesn't come from the other. They're kind of like this weird infinite sign or this weird feedback loop. Because right now, as I've been marinating over these sculptures for months as they've been existing and trying to figure out the life for them for the next 6 years, which is funny. I've also, there were things that I didn't get to realize for the show that I developed that kind of were dormant on my hard drive as I've been taking a break and gestating what happened, like what I didn't like about the sculptures, what I love about the sculptures. But in a way, what's happening now is that everything I've been building in my studio and in my home, the new virtual reality piece I'm making, the new animation promise things, but but because that it's sculpture, because living with that sculpture the last 3 years has allowed me to really like find, like having it physical, being able to walk around it, having gestalt therapy with it has allowed me to really reconsider what does it mean spatially. Like when if you put on augmented reality glasses and look at that floor rug, how can I activate that? How can I activate, you know, virtual reality chairs that seat around it like a mandala? Like I've been thinking about every sculpture that we made here has been the score for different bodies of work, like different vignettes that kind of like, which is fucking cool. And so in a way I made 5 different rooms that I think I'm going to take over my life for the next 6 years. And I'm not saying I'm going to get stagnant and slowly going to see the same shit over again. But what I'm saying is I know how I know how works age. I know how institutions treat works. I know how works travel, and I know I'm having a discourse with the larger public. And it's funny because I'm starting to see myself contextualize a lifetime of work through these kind of collaborations, which I'm ultimately grateful for. But that's been my relationship with all institutions I've worked for since I've started. Whether it's a stupid performance with a fashion queen at the kitchen, or like I don't know anything else. Every show I do is like another tattoo on my body, and I reflect on it. And sometimes the smallest shows have the most impact, and sometimes the bigger shows have little impact, and sometimes the bigger shows have big impact. But what I'm trying to say is, particularly with this one, which was an extreme breakthrough, like the virtual works did not create because I've also been drawing some of those compositions when I didn't know how to work. I didn't know how to edit a video before 2007, you know? And I was making only paintings and drawings very, very frenetically. And those were the things I was drawing. I wanted to be the next Neil Rauch. Well, not Rauch, Neil Rauch. I can't say that right now. I wanted to be like Homa Baba, I wanted to be like a very tactile, fine artist, German expressionist, like weirdo. Like I wanted to get cancer again. That was so morbid to say. But I mean, I was like unhealthily painting and making things, and I had a specific kind of idea of what I wanted to be with it and what those things meant. And then the digital took that away and allowed me to have a much more cheaper way of consolidating and really figuring out what these ideas mean. Because when I work in it's like I can I can cheaply erase things and move things around and try different compositions. And it's like I'm Joseph Albers or Johannes Itten, but with space, light, texture, color. I can play with 3,000 variables for 12 hours a day, binge watching Netflix. You know, so what I'm trying to say is that like nothing informs, I don't want to give, I think it's cheap for me to say that, oh, the digital works create the sculpture works and vice versa. It's just a weird, I don't know. I don't even know if I said anything just now.
You did. You did. It's okay. Thank you for that. I think, as I said, we are a little bit over time. But I do know that there's a lot of people have already come up to you, Jacolby, and have been admirers of your work. And thank you for ushering in their new ideas. And there's a lot of artists in this room that have felt that way. So I want to honor them by allowing a question from the audience, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. Do you need a microphone? So if there are questions for either the panel, that would be great.
I had a question. I just recently left New York, and I had an opportunity to see several shows again around.
Hold on, wait. Do you want to use the mic?
Oh, okay, no problem. What I was saying is that I really admire your work, and the first thing that came to mind was Octavia Butler and Afrofuturism and these other worlds. I wanted to know, was there any reference from Octavia Butler and these kind of worlds that she created? And then also, secondarily, I also thought of the Illustrious Blacks, which is an amazing collective in New York that I love. And their costumes, one of the pieces that you did in 2013 with the video screen, and you were, I think, in white, it made me think a lot of the costumes that they make. So just wanted to.
Okay, so I love Octavia Butler. I love Sun Ra. I love all those things. But I didn't discover, and I'm ashamed to say that I didn't discover Octavia Butler or Sun Ra until like 2006 or 7. And the thing, but what made me very happy about that discovery is that they both align their principles and their self-discovery and their making. Like the principle of Afrofuturism is creating, like taking earthly ideas, taking the entrapments of impression and recontextualizing what your body could potentially be in a war. It's almost like, in a funny way, it's almost like color theory. Like if you put a pale yellow next to a bright yellow, it does something else. What a simultaneous contrast do. It's kind of like body relativism. And so for me, I kind of grew up in this weird like Grey Gardens like environment. I grew up in a very gnarly, strange environment that like shaped me to be a different kind of African American queer dude. I mean, but the way that my coping mechanisms, I have very good ones and very bad ones, but art was always a coping mechanism. And my mother's coping mechanism with schizophrenia was drawing. For her to survive, she had to make a mark to the page and make these mechanical objects that could bring new potential meanings to her life, bring her wealth, income, and practicality. And so when I started to work with those drawings, I wanted to at first make them into costumes, and they ended up looking like Lee Bowery costumes. And someone was like, "Have you seen Lee Bowery?" And I was like, "No, I'm just making my mama drawing." And so then I was like, "Oh, I like Lee Bowery." But like the thing is, all the things that brought me to the conclusion that I got to are the same. Like my mom made drawings and journals and wrote songs just like Sun Ra and talked about, she thought she was a princess in the Middle East or something in her delusions, which is really interesting. And she also thought she was some kind of ethereal kind of goddess related to Jesus. Like, that's what happens in that kind of mental state. But it was definitely underneath the triangulation of Afrofuturist principles, which is why I was so mad when I was omitted from that show at the Student Museum. I was like, girl, you don't even know. I farted Afrofuturism. Why all your friends make themselves look like it to be in the show? So anyway, but the point is, I loved all those people. I respect them, but they were not an influence at all. But what was the most magical thing is I was like, whoa, you're not pretentious. You're not pretentious and just subscribing to this as a method that, like some people, we go to movements because we can relate to them and we try them out and we master them. But I arrived to a movement just by being in our society, being deprived in our society, growing up and surviving through mere survival. I established blindly the same coping mechanisms that these people from the 70s and 60s did. Because I grew up with my first console was a Nintendo when I was 2, and I played Final Fantasy like 1 through 8, beaten off until 9. I was like doing that. I beat, the world role-playing games and world building and J.R. Tolkien and The Hobbit and reading Elven language and like literally escapisms. Like looking at the dot on the wall while bad things are happening was my way of surviving. So my lexicon is going to be pivoted by that method. And it happens to look like Afrofuturism. But when it became so, I don't know, I don't know when it became so, yeah, and it kind of makes me like, it's funny because I appreciate it, I like it, I don't have any criticisms about it, but I don't like when it becomes a device that's like, oh, I'm just gonna be a part of this. Because for me, it was like, one of my favorite professors said to me is like, with artists, all artists hate what people imitate the most about them. Like the thing that you get, like when you start seeing, you inspire people, you see they take the things from you that are the things you want to erase the most. I mean, the last thing I want is 3,000 stars and constellations and maximally Hieronymus Bosch scenes. I wish I could make a really simple negative space composition with just like an arc, you know, like I really want brevity. I really want to silence myself. I really want poetry. I don't like the diva shit. I hate voguing. I hate everything you like about me. And that should be the next title of my show. Sure.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming.
I hate everything you like about me.